On September 16, 2001, wartime veterans of the South Saskatchewan Regiment assembled at branch number 60 of the Royal Canadian Legion to participate in a long-standing tradition. Beginning in 1946, surviving veterans of the unit met to reminisce and remember absent comrades. Originally intended only for veterans of the Dieppe raid, the scope of the event expanded in the 1950s to include all who served in the SSR during the Second World War. Weyburn hosted every second year, while Estevan, the home city of the regimental headquarters, hosted on alternate years. In 1962, veterans of the South Saskatchewan Regiment living in British Columbia started their own annual reunion, which flourished for decades, meeting in various towns such as Langley, Hope, and Chilliwack. Their membership included Cess Merritt, a BC native who commanded the SSR at Dieppe, receiving a Victoria Cross for his gallantry there. While the regiment was removed from the Army's regular order of battle in 1968, existing as a unit on paper only, the wartime veterans and their wives continued to hold both reunions. 62 years after mobilizing for the Second World War, the Regimental Association deemed there were too few surviving veterans to continue, and 2001 would be their last formal gathering. The Estevan Legion was decked out with mementos of the regiment's war years. A battalion pennant was now under glass, hanging proudly near this painting, inspired by a famous photograph taken in Normandy, showing prairie boys smiling at the head of a column of enemy prisoners. 5 days after the 9/11 attacks, with Canada's longest war still ahead of it, the veterans of Canada's costliest war assembled at the cenotaph in Estevan. The wreath was laid, the last post played, and the act of remembrance recited. On parade with the surviving veterans were 3 guests wearing wartime khaki. Russ Benoweiss, a farmer from nearby Onger, working toward a PhD in military history, had arranged to attend the reunion with 2 others of his fledgling reenactment troupe. Veterans, wives, and guests assembled at the Legion following the wreath laying. The reenactors had laid out a collection of vintage equipment as a tool to loosen the tongues of the veterans. They talked of the war a bit reluctantly, and with few tales of daring do. They spoke mainly of their good experiences. Some said nothing of the war at all, more interested in sharing pictures of houses, gardens, and grandchildren. The war was long ago, and now they were enjoying the peace they had procured. Amidst the sea of men in matching military blazers, one veteran stood out. He was savvy, introducing himself with the words, "You look just like my old platoon." No greater compliment can be paid to a reenactor, and the conversation flowed naturally from there. When photo books were produced, the dapper man let it slip that he was in this well-known photograph of the regiment in the Netherlands. Orris Keehr was just beginning his grade 12 year of high school when war broke out in 1939. In 1941 he graduated, as valedictorian of his class, into a world in which Europe had been conquered by Hitler. After a short stint teaching school, he enlisted as a private soldier in the Canadian Army. By the time the Allies returned to Europe, he was an infantry officer finishing his training in Ontario. He got overseas just as the fighting had eased off for the winter. His reinforcement holding unit at Ghent posted notice the South Saskatchewan Regiment needed a replacement officer. Keehr had been born just outside Estevan, the regiment's peacetime home. He knew what he had to do, and he fled the reinforcement unit, leaving behind a polite note, and found his way to the SSR, who made him a platoon commander. The winter quiet ended in February when the regiment attacked through the Rhineland. They crossed the Great River in March, and by April the regiment was racing to the North Sea with the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. On April 11th, the battalion finished a 2-day march of 45 miles and concentrated near Westerbork to wait for the next mission. The 2nd Division was closing in on Groningen, and the call to action came quickly in the small hours of April 12. Lieutenant Colonel Vern Stott, commanding the South Saskatchewans, was briefed at 01:15 hours. The division was driving north, and the SSR was ordered to outflank Beilen by crossing the Oranje Canal. Stott huddled with his officers at 02:45 and ordered an assault crossing. The battalion mounted in troop-carrying vehicles at 03:30 for the ride to the debussing point at Schwichelte, map reference 226757. Things began to go wrong immediately. The commanding officer's vehicle threw a track. The wireless sets he would need to direct the battalion were mounted on it, and there was a 15-minute delay as the signal platoon moved them from the carrier to a 1,500-weight truck. The convoy then moved 400 yards down the road before the 1,500-weight ran into a ditch in the darkness, and there was another delay as it was pulled out. The call moved on again, but one of the truck drivers had fallen asleep, and in the confusion no one noticed for 30 minutes. They arrived at the debussing point quite late, and the CO set up his command post at map reference 227761. The plan was to cross the canal with 2 companies due north of the debussing area and follow up with the rest of the battalion. Colonel Stott said 0 hour for 0700 and monitored his radio as the lead troop stepped off. At 0735, Colonel Stott's wireless crackled with the first code word of the day, California. B Company had assembled with no enemy opposition. At 0848, leading elements approached the bridge at map reference 225774 and reported it destroyed. Engineers began bringing up their equipment. At the same time, the code word Dakota informed the CO that A Company had completed its initial task and taken 7 prisoners. Both lead companies had gotten across the narrow canal with boats. 12 minutes later, 2 more code words, Nevada and Washington. Stott now knew that C and D companies had also crossed the water and turned west to flank Byron. Stott ordered his command post across the canal to map reference 219776. Once there, Stott decided to expand the battalion's bridgehead and link up with the division's main effort, coming up the main route north from Byron. He pointed D Company toward map reference 189779. There were Germans digging in there, and divisional-level fire support from field artillery and medium mortars was laid on to clear them out. Meanwhile, B Company moved into C Company's newly won positions, freeing C Company to continue the advance to map reference 211789. A Company remained at the bridge site to provide security for the engineers. At 1100 hours, C Company was on its objective, while D Company was held up 400 yards along its line of advance by small arms fire. An hour and a half later, D Company could report 6 prisoners taken and a number of enemy killed, for the loss of 3 soldiers wounded and 1 man dead. At 1400 hours, D Company was 400 yards short of their objective and requesting flame-throwing Terriers and 3-inch mortar support. Fire support did the trick, and at 1650 hours, D Company was on the objective, having lost 10 wounded and a man dead. By now, B Company had been ordered to move to 191786 to relieve pressure on D Company. While D Company fought forward, the engineers opened a bridge at 225774, and Support Company moved forward with the regimental aid post. At 1715 hours, the CO visited D Company to inspect their positions. The way had been opened for the 4th Brigade to continue the advance north. The 2nd Division's next stop was Groningen, which would be the largest city fight of the war for the Canadian Army. In the division's wake was the transit camp at Westerbork, which Colonel Scott visited only a few hours after the last shots were fired at Oranje Canal. Nearly 900 inmates were found there, and the war diarist of the SSR noted how cruel it was to lock people up solely because they were Jewish. It was not yet widely known that prisoners from Westerbork were routinely shipped off to extermination camps in Germany and occupied Poland for execution. The Army's official history of the Northwest Europe campaign omitted the battle fought by the South Saskatchewan Regiment across the Oranje Canal. As battles go, it was not a major engagement, and by the cruel accounting of war, the flanking action at Byron had not been costly, as only a single SSR had died that day. However, an Army photographer named Lieutenant Dan Gurevich ensured the battle a place in posterity. He accompanied the regiment into action and took a number of pictures of a Bren gunner crouching in the mud, soldiers scrambling along a ditch, and a huddled next to the safety of a brick wall. It was this photo, however, that has become the most widely reproduced. At the regimental reunion in 2001, Orris Keehr humbly mentioned that he was in the photo, and after some pressing admitted not only is he in the photo, he is literally at its center, looking back toward the camera, in a moment frozen in time. Keehr then pointed to the photo and asked, "Do you see the aura around my helmet?" Keehr explained that his platoon was waiting for him to order them forward when a Canadian vehicle known as a Wasp came up, and in the confusion of the day mistakenly turned its flame gun on them. No one was seriously hurt, but the scrim on Keehr's helmet was singed. The helmet was still simmering when Lieutenant Dan Gurevich captured it on film for all time. The war diary of the South Saskatchewan Regiment notes that 1 officer and 9 other ranks were wounded the day the famous photo was taken. Keehr was that officer, hit by a rifle bullet. The Memory Project has preserved an interview he did long after the war when he talked about his experiences at the canal that day.
The young guy came and wanted direction because he was from the other platoon, you see. And I was just talking to him, and bingo, all of a sudden he disappeared. And his top of his head was blowing right off, and he shot me on the same time, you know, just bang, bang. But because he did it so fast, he didn't quite get me. And I guess maybe I turned a little bit, and then I did get a long ways away. But I stayed on until we had consolidated that battle and so on, and then I went out in the evening to the carrier or whatever it was come up and took me out to hospital. But I guess it was a kind of a good-sized wound. Some of these brand new guys come over from Canada and from all over, and this guy, though, had been a guy who worked in an office over here, and they had to have somebody up front, you see, because they were running out of people, and he came up and was coming in on this battle, which didn't really do much for the very first thing. And he come to me and says, you know, sir, I'm terribly sick. I have to go back to the MIR, you know, to get back to the doctor. And I said, well, you're not going now. You'll come on the other side. So if I let you go now, the whole works will have that belly ache. And nobody's ever had one of those before, but they would if they thought that works. Oh, he says, I really got to go. And that's the only time I threatened one of my guys, and I didn't threaten meanly at all. I just put my hand on my pistol, and I said, you know, you have a better chance with the enemy than you have with me if you don't get across that creek. I mean, Saskatchewan guy, that thing was just a creek to me. So we've got in the same boat. I got in the boat with, yeah, that's I told him, I'll get in with me. You see, and he got in the boat with me so I could watch him. And we went across the canal, but then when we got there, we couldn't do anywhere. And finally we got those guys driven off with fire and business. And the guy who put the bandage on me, and dressed my bandage so I could go to the hospital, was the guy who was too damn shaped to come. And when I came back a few weeks later, I asked the sergeant, I said, how did that guy turn out after that little thing we had? He said, you know, he was a real good soldier. In all the fights we had after that, he was right up there. He didn't know what he was getting into, but he was going to get in it real good.
When the war ended, Orris Keehr returned to Saskatchewan, where he stayed in the military. He went on to command the Regina Rifle Regiment, and eventually No. 20 Militia Group as a brigadier general. Amazingly, he accomplished all this as a reservist, who worked full-time in the insurance industry, and devoted much time to other community endeavors, such as president of the Chamber of Commerce, Lieutenant Governor of the Kiwanis Western Canada District, Chairman of the Salvation Army, and membership in just about everything cultural, from the Regina Symphony Orchestra to the Saskatchewan Rough Riders Corporate Directors Committee. Daniel A. Gurevich left the Army in 1945 as a captain and went on to fame as an Arctic photographer. He died in 1997, just shy of his 80th birthday, having worked tirelessly to change public perception of polar bears. Dr. Douglas Russ Benoist finished a master's degree in strategic studies and a doctorate in history at the University of Calgary. His death from illness at the age of 51 in 2017 surprised some and grieved many. In 1952, Kibbsey Lake was named after Private John Kibbsey as part of the provincial government's program of naming a geographical feature after every single Saskatchewan soldier killed in war. Kibbsey, born in Poland in 1925, was the only soldier of the South Saskatchewan Regiment to lose his life in the fighting on April 12, 1945. Killed at the age of 21, the inscription on his gravestone at Holton Military Cemetery is from the Act of Remembrance. In 2015, Kibbsey's surviving half-brothers placed a memorial tablet on the spot he died, just north of the crossing point on the Oranje Canal, 70 years to the day he was killed in action. As it turned out, the 2001 reunion was not the last, but more recent gatherings have certainly been more modest in scale, and have not included Brigadier General Orris Julian Keehr, whose death in 2012 was marked by a 2-column obituary in the Regina Leader-Post. He had belonged to too many civic organizations to list, and had done too much in the military to recount. It was enough for them to say he had founded the Royal Regina Golf Club, been its president, and launched a junior tournament in 1980. And that the whole city of Regina was poorer for his loss. When Orris Keehr autographed this picture of himself in 2001, he had been too modest to discuss his distinguished career or his successful life after the war. On those of us that remain lies the obligation of remembrance, not only of the fallen, but of the quiet leaders who survived to contribute long lives of service to their communities.